Yeah. So hi, for those that don't know me, I'm in Cunningham. I'm from the Self-Managed Learning College on the south of England. Obviously, therefore, some of my remarks may be set in more of a British context, or even an English context. But I want to talk more generally about the nature of education as it is globally. And my overarching thesis is that many of the issues we face as a planet are due to faulty education, and that this is not being recognised. One small story is that I was on a webinar, which was a 1.5 hours, with two of the big gurus, both of them in the bestsellers list. I won't mention their names, not to shame them. And in 1.5 hours, talking about the issues that face the planet, they never mentioned the word learning at all once. And I think that's quite normal. So people pontificate about the issues. And here's just a quick, these are the kind of issues that people say are around and that are affecting humanity and are particularly problematic. We all know about global warming, the destruction of the planet. I think that the notion that we are a species which is permitted to plunder the planet has become a problem. And again, my view would be we've learned that it wasn't how we were in the past. I've just been reading a book by Charles Foster called Being a Human. I haven't finished it yet, and he's a writer from Oxford University, but one of the things he did was to go and live in a part of England like hunter-gatherer people. So they lived off the land, they mainly lived off roadkill. And what he was interested in was that notion of connecting in a different way, in the way that he identifies hunter-gatherer people, who are the first 95% of human history. And he talks about the Upper Pleistocene as the particular period, and I'll read you a bit from his book because it's just a very neat summary. And it's totally supported. All of the things that he says are totally supported by all the archaeological and anthropological evidence. So he says, hunter-gatherers were, and the few that survive often are, wanderers intimately, reverently, and often ecstatically connected to lots of land and many species. They live long and relatively disease-free lives, and there's little evidence of human-to-human violence. It was a time of leisure. You can't hunt or gather all day and all night. And so I think it was a time of reflection, of story, of trying to make sense of things. The earliest human art on the cave walls of Southern Europe is amongst the best there has ever been. It's also the most elusive and elusive. And then he goes on to talk about how about 40,000 years ago, people started to settle down in what was called the Neolithic age and create settlements, owned land, owned animals, owned people, of course, where slavery grew up. None of this existed, of course, for the first 95% of our history. And so he comments about the Neolithic. Although the mental attitude of the Neolithic was hubristic control, the reality was very different. Humans began to be controlled. They had to settle in their settlements. They had to get in the harvest. Settlement brought politics, hierarchy, and man-made law. And I think that's a deliberate, it is man-made. Women were owned just as slaves were owned. Lives shortened, pestilence galloped, and bones were distorted by strenuous grinding and lifting. The enslavers of pigs and reapers of corn were themselves enslaved and skied down. The cycle of the seasons, which had previously propelled them, now ground them down, and they were tyrannized, not enriched by the law of supply and demand. Leisure vanished. So he's pretty damning, and his book is about how he attempted to go and connect to the planet rather than see it as a disconnected entity. And some of the readings I've done with indigenous scholars make that point, that our language is a very noun-oriented language. It's about people, planet, as though we're two separate entities, whereas indigenous people have more processed language, which suggests that we are intimately connected and we're part of one thing and engaged together collectively in that. And that we've lost that is Foster's argument and many others. So species survival, obvious, politics and democracy, and how obviously a lot of talk here about the notion of democracy, but I'm not always sure about whether I agree with the way that's played out. And if I give one example again from a hunter-gatherer people, the San of the Kalahari, and a very good writer called James Sussman talks about them as being the world's oldest civilization, 100,000 years old. And they have more right to call themselves a civilization than Athenian Greece, which after all treated slaves no better than animals and didn't actually see that slaves were part of the human race almost. So for me, the San people are more entitled to the word civilized than Europe it was and is now still. Anyway, they were living under democracy, not under democracy, under dictatorship. And then the people came from the capital city to the band and said to them, oh, we now have a democracy, you can now vote. And the San people said, we don't want to vote, we just want to be left alone. We don't want to choose people to take control of us, which is what democracy means. What we want is to be able to lead our own lives. And it raises up the issue, it's a term used in the European Union about subsidiarity, that decision-making should be at the base, at the level it should be. And of course, my argument, and I think most people at this conference would be, if you're making decisions about learning, it should be by the child, by the learner, not by parents, not by the state for sure. So the next point about role of states and markets is that we have certainly in Europe market-driven processes, but also the state is intervening more, and that's true of a number of European countries. Certainly in England, there is a pressure for the state to intervene more, for instance, to attempt to reduce home education by controlling and inspecting the current rights of parents and families. And that raises a lot of issues. Growth of fascism. There's a wonderful book by Paul Mason on how to stop fascism. But what he says is that the fascists and the ultra-right mainly have a fear of freedom. And I've never really thought of that before, but they have a fear of freedom for themselves as well as for other people. And they're opposed to freedom. And of course, we're in favor of freedom. Hopefully everybody is. But why have these people learned to be that way? They're not born that way. It isn't in the genes. Anyway, mental health and suicides, obesity, the current pandemic and how badly that's been managed, the interface between science and politics has been terrible. And of course, the global scourge of loneliness, and one of the reasons people die earlier. So I have a formula which I kind of use for the mathematically inclined. It's slightly phony, but I would say you are a function of what's in your genes, what you've learned, and any physical changes you've gone through. There may be an X factor. Religious people would say there's something else, spirit or whatever, and I'm prepared to put that in just in case. But the things that we know for sure are that, first of all, the genes make an impact on us. Secondly, that we change physically over time. I try to do things now that I used to do when I'm younger, but at the age of 78, I'm not quite as fit as I used to be, although I still dance and cycle and do other things. So if we allow for the fact that you can't do anything about the genes, particularly, well, you can, the epigenetics says you can switch genes on and off, which will be to do with learning, and physical change, we can learn to work better. But the core issue is, if we're to be better as a human race, we have to learn. There isn't any other option. That's the only way that humans can change for the better, is through learning. And that we have to engage with learning in a different kind of way. The kind of learning that we've been doing is completely faulty. That what is taught does not equal what is learned. That the average textbook in England written about teaching and learning is 90% about teaching and 10% about learning. And I'm not very interested in teaching. In our college, we don't have any teachers. It's quite interesting. We talk about what we don't have as a way of explaining. We don't have a curriculum, we don't have teachers, we don't have classrooms, etc. Because we're interested in learning and we're interested in applying the best evidence about how people can learn. But one of the other things that's crucial is learning's not one thing. The verb to learn doesn't cover only one process. It's a problem in the English language. And it may well not be a problem in other languages, but certainly in English, we use the verb to learn to cover a range of processes. For instance, I might have just learned the change in the bus timetable locally. So it's a piece of learning, but it's quite trivial. But that's hugely different from people to learn to act differently, to behave differently, to be more confident, to be more self-aware, to have a more fulfilling life. These are different kinds of learning. And what I'm interested in is that big picture stuff. How do you learn to be free when people have been in chains? And that's a different kind of learning from especially the knowledge-driven learning that is dictated by certainly most of the schools that I come across. So here are some things that seem to me to be a change in mindset that we need. It isn't about absorbing more stuff. The Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, to give it its full title, with the Queen as its patron, has this kind of motto: think like a system, act like an entrepreneur. And I think there's a lot in that. We have to think about the global system. We have to understand that we are connected to all of the human beings and to all the species on Earth and to the rocks and the trees and to everything, and that we need to think about that as a system. And what I put there, school is anti-systemic, because school actually teaches you not to be systemic and therefore not to think ecologically. School teaches people to think in subject terms. You learn history and geography and science and etc. And all of these subjects are separated out and examined. And that's common globally, that there is a notion of a subject that can be learned. There are no such things as subject. It's merely an educational invention. Throughout human history, we've never had subjects. Back to hunter-gatherer people, there were no subjects. People learned how to live in their environment. They learned to help young people learn to live effectively in their environment and to think and act ecologically. Whereas, just to take a very trivial example, if you take history and geography, everything in history, it happens in a place. When I learned history, it was all about history of England, actually, or Britain. And despite the notion that we learn history to understand the world, that was far from the truth. It was very ethnocentric, very based on how do I learn about British history. But all of that occurs in a place. So that's all about geography. But if you take geography, everything in geography is about the past. There is nothing in geography that doesn't come from the past. Most of the global systems have high impact from humans, and that's historical. We've historically done all sorts of things to the planet, and that has occurred in history. So how can we separate history and geography? And you could go on through all the subjects. How can you separate out the things that occur to us in the world? Also, the way in which the English language works and the way in which it's taught is about things, not processes. So it's about, we learn these things. The current aim of the academics in this country is about a knowledge-rich curriculum. And that is the notion of a curriculum as a thing, a real thing, as opposed to a human invention. And there's nothing, what's missed is the processes of learning and about how we engage in a different kind of way with the world. Because school genuinely creates some of the major problems. It's also, of course, schools talk about democracy, but demonstrate through the hidden curriculum schooling that there is no democracy. That what happens is that you have lessons on how Britain is a democracy, and it's done in an authoritarian way where the young people have no say, by and large, in what is in the curriculum. So we have a system which is a problem. And in terms of all those issues that I mentioned, schooling is a major contributor to creating those issues. The assumption is that when you lecture to people, it'll bring about change. So if you take obesity, children are all lectured to about how they should eat properly, and yet we have a growing obesity problem. We also have a problem in our area of drug abuse. And all the schools on inspections by the government inspectors are told they're doing a great job on drugs education. Actually, what I know from talking to young people who come to us is that they find some of the drug lessons interesting because they're drugs they didn't know about and they wanted to go and try them. But certainly the notion of knowing more about these things that will help you is bizarre. And the fact that there is this disconnect between what people are learning and what they're actually engaged in their lives is bizarre. I mean, again, in school they'll have anti-litter campaigns, but here I live near a beach, and after a holiday period, the beaches here, there are tons, literally tons of litter to be removed because people have no sense of a connection to that beach. When I go on the beach, you know, I sit amongst the stones and they're beautiful stones and I'm aware of a sea and connected to the sea. It's a process. But because people go and sit on that beach and are separated from it and don't see it as part of them or that they've got any responsibility to that beach, then of course they litter it, and it's appalling. So another one I mentioned is notion of helicopter mind, and it's a bit linked to this because it was one of the clients that I worked with when I was working with organizations, that their senior people, and this was on a major international company, they were choosing people who they said had helicopter mind. And that was the notion that you're both connected into what's going on and hovering above it at the same time. So when I'm talking to a student and engaging with them about something, I'm also aware of that person and our relationship within a wider relationship in the world. And in other words, this conversation is not an isolated conversation, it's part of a bigger picture. And that I must all the time be aware of a moral compass of what we're wanting to achieve with the students and how we're encouraging and helping them, and that we have a connection to those wider issues. We're not just doing things in isolation. Another part of the mindset problem is there's 3 P's here, and we have a choice. I'll start with puzzle. Education is a lot about solving puzzles. So it's like a jigsaw puzzle or a crossword puzzle. So there are known answers in maths. There are known answers I'm talking about school level now, tests. I was a chemist, if you do a chemistry test, there are known answers to the questions. So these are puzzles, so people learn to solve puzzles. The other end of the scale is what I would call a predicament. That means that there's something out there that you can't do anything about. So a lot of people actually would think, well, there's nothing I can do about global heating. And I was up in Scotland recently and my Scots friends were going, well, you know, all of you will want to come up here in the future because you will be frazzling down there in the south and we will have a much nicer climate up here, as though this is just a predicament, it's nothing you can do about it. And there's lots of things like that. Obviously, you know, the sun rises or sets each day. It's just how the world is. In between that, I'm calling this something called a problem, and that's something that we choose. I'm choosing to make it a problem to address the issue of the climate, but a lot of people choose not to. In other words, we choose good problems to work on. And in school, they're not helped to think that way. And yet what we have is a whole load of problems that we can see, but a lot of people would treat them either as predicaments. Well, I can't do anything about it. You know, people are obese, there's nothing I can do about it. Or, well, there's loneliness, but I'm not lonely and therefore it's not my problem. So the issue is, how do we choose good problems? Problems are always based on a value judgment and a belief system. 2 things. Values are what we care about, and beliefs are what we hold to be true. So a lot of people believe that there's nothing you can do about things. It's why I mentioned Greta Thunberg in my little blurb about today. I know she's kind of overpopularized and oversold in a way, but I mean, this was someone who did think like a system and act like an entrepreneur. I mean, she studied all of this and went through a very difficult time in her life. In the end, said, I'm going to go and do my strike and sit outside with my banner about student strike for climate. She chose to make it a problem, and lots of people don't. And I think, and school, in a sense, orients people to say, well, you should know about this stuff, but you don't actually do anything about it. Schooling is very much about learning the academic stuff, but not what to do. And in a lot of cases, that's fair enough. I mean, for instance, if you're a parent and your daughter comes home and said, we had sex education at school today, you would probably think that was a good thing if you're a good liberal-minded parent. If your daughter comes home and said, we had sex training today at school, you might respond differently. And therefore, clearly the notion of training is about practical application and doing something. In that particular case, it may not be welcome, but in what school focuses on is learning about stuff that's disconnected from the world. So I've said, as you know, there are two kinds of people in the world, people who divide people into two kinds and people who don't. And this is a crude dichotomy of saying that schools orientation is to add new knowledge, stuff things, the notion is a person is an empty bucket and we're putting more stuff in. And it's a leaky bucket, so we have to, when we get older, have a top up because the stuff leaks out at the bottom. What we really need to be focusing on is habit change, changing behavioral patterns. And that's a whole different kind of learning. It's about how do you think differently about the world? How do you say, yeah, I have some responsibility here. If I drop some litter on this beach, I have a responsibility to the planet. And what am I doing if I drop some litter and I don't care about it? And that's a habit issue because people know you don't drop litter. You can get fined for it if you get caught. And I see what's called fly tipping, people dumping mattresses and refrigerators in our national park here on the South Downs, which is beautiful country. And what are people doing? And that is a habit issue. They know it's wrong and they know that they can get fined if they are caught, but they still do it. And it's that kind of change that we need, and that education is never going to take us down that route. The traditional schooling isn't going to do it. Here's a murmuration of starlings. I love the word. You don't say it's a group or a flock of starlings. In the English language, it's called a murmuration. And we have these over the pier here in Brighton, where I live. What's interesting about that is that although it looks like it, there's no one in charge. Starlings, when they're going together, have to know two things. How quickly is my neighbor going and how far am I away from thy neighbor? In other words, they have to obey two basic rules, if you like. And so they're self-organizing. And that's one of the things that I think we obviously promote within our learning community. In our college, we have 53 students at the moment. And they're split into two groups, actually two programs. But part of the objective is that they are in a self-organizing system. We don't talk much about democracy, though people would see it as democratic since we don't impose on students and we as a community work out the rules. But a lot of it is about people self-organizing and just doing things with other people. And so sometimes people come around and visit and think that they're not learning anything because they're maybe chatting and doing stuff that doesn't seem to relate to anything. But a lot of the time that's about them organizing themselves and connecting with others and engaging with others in discussion and dialogue. And so one of the things that is important is thinking about, again, how schools then tend to think, and that what happens in school, because they create the rules, of course, the teachers create the rules, and the students then have a choice between dependence, that is doing what you're told, or counter-dependence, which is rebelling against it. So counter-dependence is like the boy saying, I'm not influenced by my father, I just do the opposite of what he says. But of course, by doing the opposite, you are. So what happens is that young people are either trapped in I must do what I'm told and learn dependency, and then leave school dependent on a system out there that isn't going to support them. Well, they should do something about it, they say, as though there's some mysterious they that will always solve their problems, but we know they won't. So then they rebel, and that it doesn't get you anywhere either. So, I'm told not to take drugs, so I will do. But there's no kind of thinking within that. And what I'm interested in is independence and interdependence, and that flip between I am me and I am me in relationship to other people. I become a self through my relationships. so that I can be, so in amongst our 53 students, there are 53 curricula because they all design their own, but they also are doing that in relationship to other people. They're not doing it on their own. They are connecting with others and talking through and engaging to create what they want to create to learn. And that's what you do in organizations. And in fact, most of my life I've worked in organizations, and actually they're an easier place to talk about these issues than I find the educational world, because they understand that notion of, yes, we do want people who are independent and interdependent. That's how organizations work. We don't want dependency where somebody's looking to the boss to do everything. And we certainly don't want people rebelling and reacting against things just because that's all they can do. But it's two different kind of mindsets, and making that switch is really important. And obviously when people come from schools, they do take a while sometimes to understand that, especially when they come with a sort of dependent mindset that they just see, well, school hasn't been nice, so therefore I want to be in some place which is nicer, but which is like school but nicer, and can be a bit of a shock when they realize they're actually going to have to think about what problems they want to choose to address, because in a way learning is based on a problem. It's by saying, for instance, you may want to learn another language, so you go, well, at the moment I don't know anything about it and I want to be fluent in it, so that's a problem, but you've chosen that problem. And in a sense, all learning is based around choosing problems. 10 years ago, I decided to learn contemporary dance, and I'd never done anything before in contemporary dance. And so, but I chose it as a problem. I decided I really like this idea of dance that isn't bound by ballet and other kind of fixed modes, and that you can do anything you like. And so over the last 10 years, I've been learning that, but that's my choice to learn that. I've always danced and enjoyed moving, but now I enjoy performing as well. And that's obviously learning some new things. But I'm in a company, and it's very important, therefore, that we are interdependent within the company. I might have a duet with somebody, or it might be a whole group working together. And the word company, interestingly, in the English language has come from the Latin com panis, which is breaking bread together. And it is that notion of connecting. Obviously, food is a way humans have always used to connect, that we break bread together. We engage together over food as one of the ways in which we live as effective human beings. So I just put that piece of research about death rates in hospitals. If people don't learn interdependence, more people die. I mean, it's as straightforward as that. Thousands of people every year over the world die, nothing to do with the ability of a particular individual in the hospital. It's to do with the fact that people not working effectively, people working in silos, people not trusting other people. And that has been proved. This is one research study. Every research study that I've seen, certainly in the UK context, shows that death rates are one of the major reasons that affect why people don't come out of hospital after surgery, is because of hospital staff not working well together. But I put at the bottom there, bridging is also needed. That is, we need to know how to connect beyond the team we're in. Bonding is great, but bridging across, I'm back to my notion of how connecting out into the wider world, that what we're doing is part of a wider context. And that if you take, for instance, the financial crisis of 2008, all the research shows that it was to do with teams coming up with crazy ideas because they were well-schooled but ill-educated people with PhDs and MBAs, and who came up with toxic gimmicks which caused misery for millions of people all over the world, the demise of companies, etc., just because people didn't know how to bridge across those teams. So within those banks and financial institutions, people worked in isolation, because that's what education teaches you to do. A slide I haven't put up, but which I do have, is cheating and stealing. In school, if you help somebody in a test, it's called cheating. You get punished for it. In life, cheating is essential. Similarly, in organizations, the way in which we innovate is stealing ideas from people. It's essential to steal ideas from other people. course, the joke in academia is that if you steal ideas from one person, it's called plagiarism and you get punished for it. If you steal ideas from lots of people, it's called research and you get praised for it. The whole system is mad. Right, here's some just then, if you like, kind of random issues picked out before I go into one last slide, and then I'm happy to open it up for questions and comments. Disconnected connection. We are connected to others in a disconnected way, like now. Like I feel very frustrated that I'm sitting here on Zoom, and the last IDEC I was at was in India, which was fabulous. I love India, and just being there to eat the food, to engage with people in 3D rather than 2D like this, and in this disconnected way is such a loss. And a lot of our learning needs to come through that direct connection. But where I go to places and I see like a mother walking down the road with a child in a pram and on a smartphone and not looking at the child and not engaging with the child. What is this? You know, that we get obsessed with technology, which disconnects us. So although it connects us at one level, it's disconnected at another level. But this has always been true. It's just we brought it more into. I mean, in a sense, letters and phones are a disconnect, but at least we knew that they were limited and that most of our connections with people were face-to-face and engaging with them. And now we've lost a lot of that. And people work off screens, and there's a worry, of course, that children are growing up as screen people. The next just quick issue was neurodiversity. Baron Cohen, who's a professor at Cambridge and one of the world's big experts on autism, but he's saying that probably 25% of people are neurodiverse. If you not just add autism, but you add in dyslexia, dyscalculia, etc., that it's about 25%. In our community, it's almost 100% of people have some kind of issues, but that's fine. But what we have to then start to do is to think differently. Again, school is the place where autistic kids are let down badly. Still, disability is not handled well, certainly in England. It is handled better in other countries. The fact that people are different, and yet schooling is still driven by a notion that everybody should be the same somehow, that it's the same curriculum. I worked with a school that's for the most disabled children. These are ones who often can't have no visual or auditory, so they're both blind and deaf. They may be not able to move. It's a place that has to, every wheelchair that they have is made for that individual, because many of them have got twisted spines and all sorts of difficulties. And for some that won't make adulthood. And I was working with the principal there, and he was arguing about how he had to try and get around the fact that he was supposed to teach a curriculum. It's a different curriculum for them, but it was a fixed curriculum. And I helped him to find a way to what is called in England disapplying it. But the notion that even in a place which was dealing with the most damaged children, there's a notion there should be a standard curriculum, and that somehow a child who wasn't going to live to adulthood should have to learn these things, when what they needed to learn was to be happy and to have a meaningful life during the short life that they had. And yet, what an uncivilized society we are. And I'm back to sound people of 100,000 years, a proper civilization, and we're not civilized at all. We're not civilized when I walk down the street and see people living in doorways with nowhere to live. This is not a civilized country. But I would back to saying, but we have to learn. And one of the things is about difference, and how do we deal with difference, and the fact that somebody lying in a doorway who's looking dirty and disheveled is still a person. Locus of control, that's about really this notion that how do we start to have a sense that we can take control of our own lives? That's called internal locus of control. The notion of external locus of control is the notion that other people do things and we respond to it, that our role is to be, if you like, blown along by the winds of the society which we're in, and that we don't have control of that. And for many young people in state schools, that's what they're educated to believe. Interestingly, the 7% of children who go to private independent schools in this country tend to get a high locus of control. That is part of what those schools do, is to say you're going to be the future leaders, you're the people who can take charge of your own lives. And the downside of that is, of course, it encourages a great arrogance, as we see currently in the British cabinet and our Prime Minister, who is an arrogant liar, but who believes I'm in charge of my life and I can do what I like. So there's a danger in that. But the other side of the danger is if you don't have any sense that you can take charge of your life, what are you going to do with your life? Your life is down to other people. So you're born, you live, you die. Is that it? A couple of points there. We have roles as adults, and I've been quite taken with this notion of Aloe parenting. So notion of, because I'm a grandparent, I have 2 grandchildren and 2 step-grandchildren. So 4 that I'm an Aloe parent for. And that's notion that, and it goes back to hunter-gatherer people, where we know, and Peter Gray's written about this, as many others have done, that in those bands, all the adults would play a role in the development of the children. It was not within a unitary family to a mother and father and the child, and everybody else was doing their own thing. There's something about the roles that we need to play as adults. And I think especially my generation, I mean, we've caused a lot of the problems in the world. We've been ill-schooled, but we need to now start to think, what is our role as Aloe parents, as people who have a role of parenting with others? And the point, I mean, at the bottom there is the need for what I'm calling skin in the game, that what we need is what Taleb calls skin in the game. That is, we need to actually get involved and do stuff. And obviously I'm preaching to the converted here, but there are a lot of people out there who go, oh, this is terrible. But, you know, back to this notion of, well, it's just a predicament. I can't do anything about it. I think when we started the college 20 years ago, it was just started, well, let's just do something in our house. And we did it. And it's been huge fun. And it does need, again, back to our adult role, recognizing that we shouldn't stand on the sidelines and shout at the people who are playing the leadership roles in our society. We have to engage with them, but not as these are evil people. I have the real difficulty with teachers. Some of the teachers, when you see most teachers try their best, but some are pretty horrible. But you have to back off and say, but they've learned that. They weren't born that way. There is no gene for evil. People aren't born doing evil things. And it's something that is learned. I did work with prisoners once, and you can see they've learned or not learned. More than 50% of the people in prison in England are functionally illiterate, and they've been to school, and they wouldn't be in prison if they were literate. And many of the others have mental health problems, and they shouldn't be in prison, and they need help. But the kind of help they need is not a welfare help. It's a learning issue. It's about how do we engage with people to learn differently when they're younger, so that they can actually lead adult lives. So I want to stop there and give people a chance to make comments. I'll try and get rid of the screen, whatever it is. Stop sharing. There we go. I guess you kind of throw your hands in or whatever. I don't know what the rules are within this community, but as far as I'm concerned, if you put a hand up and I see you, then just unmute yourself. And so anybody wants it? No.
Hello. I'm a teacher of English. I'm in Greece now, and I'm an ex-member of the Summerhill staff. First, I wanted to thank you because for what you did for the trial for Summerhill. Your contribution was invaluable, and I'm so honored and happy to meet you in person through technology. That was very important what you did. And I used it because I give lectures in Greece about Summerhill. I've used it a lot, all the results. And that was an incredible job you did. And I'm sure everybody is very thankful for your very valuable contribution.
Thank you.
The second thing I want to say is that I was very moved by all I heard. And I'm very glad that I've listened to your presentation. I have one question. I didn't quite understand what this ALLO parenting you mentioned. I missed what you were trying to say. If you could elaborate on that briefly, please. Thank you.
Yes, the notion of allo parenting is that other adults play a parenting role with children, so that I have a son and a daughter, so I am their parent, but I have a grandson and 3 granddaughters, and it's allo parenting. But anybody could do this. I mean, I had family friends who, when I was growing up, who my parents would say, it's your uncle or your aunt, but they weren't literally relatives. They would just be people that were friends of my parents, and they would play a role in my life, a valuable role. For instance, my father was quite kind of right-wing politics, and actually it was a very distant relative who lived close by, who I managed to talk to because he was a trade unionist, and I managed to get another insight into the world of work through someone who was in a trade union. So it was what is now being called allo parenting. The person is acting in the place of a parent, doing what parents are expected to do, but which I think the argument from the people who, for instance, talk about hunter-gatherer bands is that we push too much on individual parents because we have collapsed the family into the nuclear family. And certainly in England, that has become, people live behind their closed doors. And, I actually kind of friendly with the girl who lives across the road because we both support Manchester United, and I go and chat to her and sometimes give her things that I get from Manchester United. And so I play a role with her, which is like allo parenting. I have no relationship to her, but I'm an adult who has some involvement in her life. And I think that's a useful term because it's saying it's more than just your friends with a child, that you have some role in their learning and development, and that you should think of yourself in a kind of parent relationship almost, even though you're not related to this person. And I certainly see that in a number of the students I've worked with in the college who I'd be in touch with after they've left, and I'm playing a role with them and like with their career choices and things, and so it's a role that parents might play, and it's like, how do we work together? So in our college, for instance, we have a 3-way meeting every term between the student, the birth parents, and one of our team. And in a way, it's kind of like allo parenting, because that member of our team is working with 6 of the students and gets to know them really well, and is working with the parent in a system, and it's also, what it does is to encourage parents not to get too uptight, because it's quite a pressure on the, especially we have high proportion of single parents who feel the pressure enormously and obviously they're more than women than men, feeling that pressure of, I am the sole parent for these children, and they shouldn't feel that way. They should feel that there is a supportive context within that they're working within their community. Does that make sense to? You're muted.
Yes, I got it. Sorry. I missed it at the beginning. It's absolutely clear. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I hadn't explained it in full, but thanks for the question. Allowed me to do that.
There's also a relative question about this in the chat, if you have access to the chat.
Okay.
It says, whereas in loco parentis in schools doesn't have the same emotional relationship?
In local parenting in schools, no. Well, yes, because I think in school often it's a mechanistic relationship. Now I know that many cases people will say that particular teachers have been valuable to them in their lives. I can't think of any from my childhood, but in loco parentis, of course, is a legal kind of terminology and doesn't necessarily imply an emotional involvement. And indeed, we certainly have in schools the notion of a separation of the academic and what's called the pastoral, which I totally resent. But we have people in schools who are called pastoral people, meaning if you have a problem with your feelings, you go and talk to that person because your teacher is there. This is especially secondary schools I'm talking about. And I'm reminded of Bishop William Temple's statement that in school, you have to think together and feel separately. Whereas what we want in the learning community is you feel together and think separately. In other words, we feel as a family, and actually our students say that sometimes, we feel like a family, but we all can think in the way that we want to think. Whereas schooling requires you to think the same way because otherwise you won't pass your exams, but feelings belong somewhere else. You get sent to the counsellor or the child and adult mental health service or the doctor or somewhere else. Because if you're teaching a child, you're teaching a subject, not the child. Now, that's not true of all secondary teachers, but it's a common part of the secondary school culture in many schools in the secondary education sector in England. Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah, this is Gidi. I'm talking from Israel. If I may, I want to share my frustration. I mean, not in the context of saving the world, in the sense that I think that this is the most important subject that should be learned in the education system today, when we finally, we arrogant humanity, realize that we are going towards destruction. Now, I don't see any global, how do you say, movement of educators towards this goal. Some country here, some country there start to put education on sustainability as a compulsory subject, but there's no, how would I say, conferences and an urge of educators from, as I said, developed countries at least, and other countries as well. This is one of my frustrations, because I believe that indeed, as big people say, people said before me, changing the culture requires changing education. What would you say?
Well, I agree with you. I'll come to Derry in a minute. He's got his hand up because and it's why I'm interested in and why I wanted to do this session, because I think we need more of those connections, because it has to go beyond. We can't just be in the walls of our own schools and colleges and communities or whatever. It is about those connections that we have to have. Obviously, IDEC helps because there's a reality when we're together of those connections. But I agree with you about the global changes. Then there are some really important issues which are trivialized by people saying, "Oh, we'll educate. It's about teaching in the classroom." You go, "Well, no, it's not that. It's about our relationship to the earth, and who we are as humans." The book by Charles Foster is called "Being a Human," and what he's trying to explore is what does it mean to be a human in a different kind of way, and a way that existed prior to the agricultural revolution, and struggling with that. And it's quite fascinating how him and his son live off roadkill and berries that they pick and various things like that. And he decides to fast for, I think, 8 days at one stage, and while his son's going off killing squirrels and cooking them, and he's saying deliberately being through the winter, where they're in a part of the country where there's snow and where they're having to, one level be miserable, but another level not, because of the joy of connecting to the wood that they're in. So yeah, I agree. We need more of these conversations. I've only scratched the surface today, obviously. Sorry, Derry, you had your hand up.
Thank you. Thank you.
Muted.
Ash, you missed all my Irish swearing there, It always happens. I was just going to say to Giddy that the national curriculum in Italy is completely geared around sustainability now, education for sustainability. And then at the international level, the problem is making it work. The systems are there. When the United Nations in 2015 created Agenda 1930, we've got to have a sustainable planet by 1930, and sustainable goal 4 is providing primary and secondary education for all the kids in the world. Quality is the word in there, quality education. And if you look at the 7th target of goal number 4, it does say education for sustainability. So there is a kind of framework there which pretty well all the governments of the world have signed up to. The problem is making the buggers do anything about it. And one of the nice things about sustainability goal 4 is that instrumental in bringing it about and developing the wording was a woman called Antonia Wolf, who 14 years ago was chair of the Finnish-speaking Swedish School Students Association. So she came up through a democratic Nordic country, through democratic structures. She then went to work for Education International, the International Teachers Union organization, and from there she found herself in the position in New York actually drawing up sustainability goal 4. So there's a thread there of hope, if you like, that the people involved as kids were totally committed to all the things that Ian's talking about. This girl, Antonia Wolf, ran a program in 8 schools in Helsinki when she was only 19 to try and make the schools more democratic and participative, with many more opportunities for students to develop their own learning purposes apart from the national curriculum, which is very loose framework in Finland. Sorry, I could go on about this a bit. The problem is the lack of support, and at the civil servant level in governments and the political level, there's not enough pressure from below on these people to make the structures that could work if only they felt impelled to do so. And I think that's up to all of us to know that these structures are there and to press our politicians to do something about it. And I completely agree with everything said about what's the appropriate word for our current Prime Minister. You were very polite, and I'd be a lot ruder than you were. But how to make these people take the structures that are beginning to exist and could give some hope, how to actually make them work.
Thanks, Terry. Obviously this has to be the last comment, I think, because we've got to go on to the other. So just a quick points. One is that I don't like the notion that all children must be forced to go to school, and we're engaged in a campaign at the moment against the English government to stop them trying to stop home education. But are we going to go into the jungles of the Amazon and force hunter-gatherer kids to go to school? Of course not. So global efforts to say school is the answer, it's not. And many parents are saying the state is the stumbling block, and therefore we're not going to go into school, where school will educate our children in a way that doesn't help them to be ecological. I think sustainability, I mean, I love the people in Lesbos, so they need some money. They have a fantastic community there with the refugee children and the local children, and the Norwegians have done research on that about sustainability issue. But what they're doing is a proper community. It's not a school. The last I heard, that the only building they had was a tent. And what they're trying to do is to explore sustainability for real out in the island, and also engage in those international issues about refugees. So I think there are people doing stuff, and they're really important. They do need our support. So if anyone's got any spare money, send some money to them, because they need it. And thanks everybody for today. Thanks for coming. Thanks for the comments. If anybody wants to be in touch with me, it's pretty easy to get my email address. You can get Self-Managed Learning College up on Google. And if anybody wants a PDF copy of my last book, I'll send you to that without any charge. Just get in touch with me. And thanks again, and hope everybody enjoys the rest of the conference tomorrow.
So much. Thank you so very much. We're so grateful, and thank you. See you around.
Thank you.
See you in Leicester next year. Huh?